of thyroid cancer had a TSH of 0.4 and below, where people are often still claiming that if you have a 2.0 TSH, you're normal. But I think there is good evidence that health improves when you lower the TSH down to somewhere in that range, less than 0.4.
And what do you think about the thyroid medication that's out there, Armour versus the synthetics, Cytomel? What's your take on that?
The first time I ran into problems with thyroid supplements was when I was teaching at the Naturopath College. A woman went to the university hospital in a coma, and her history had been that she was somewhat hypothyroid, and so they gave her a T4 thyroxine supplement, 1 grain, and she got worse, so they gave her 2 grains equivalent, which I think was 200 micrograms, and they kept increasing it as she got worse, and at the point of 500 micrograms of thyroxine, she was in a coma and in the hospital.
I'm sorry, it's not funny, but it makes me laugh.
They gave her intravenous T3, and she came right out of the coma. And that started me paying attention to women who were, most of them were getting Synthroid, just a pure thyroxine supplement.
That's what my mother got.
Several of them described their symptoms getting worse as they increased the dose. Some of them described strange noises in their heads or strange body sensations that sometimes happen in hypothyroid people. And so I read pretty thoroughly the animal research on T3 and saw that the brain, regardless of what is happening in your bloodstream, the brain usually keeps a ratio of 1-to-1 T4 to T3, even though the bloodstream might have 40 or 50 times more T4 than T3. The brain requires practically equal amounts to function, and an experimenter took slices of brain tissue in a dish, measuring their oxygen consumption, and showed that when thyroxine was added to the slice, the oxygen consumption decreased, which is exactly the opposite of what T3 does when it's added to a tissue. So this is apparently what happens when someone goes into a coma while taking huge doses of thyroxine, or starts hallucinating when they're increasing their plain T4 dose. It's reaching such a concentration that the brain can no longer maintain its 1-to-1 ratio of T4 to T3. And so it's actually displacing the T3 and causing hypothyroid symptoms because T3 is the active hormone.
What does that mean? That most of us who are hypothyroid should be looking at something like, instead of Armour thyroid, like a Cytomel, or what?
Well, the trouble with Cytomel is that it's very fast-acting. For example, if I'm writing and I can't remember someone's name, I'll pick up a 5-microgram chip of Cytomel and chew it up, and in about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, I can remember anyone's name that I want to. Almost instantaneous when you chew it. It peaks after an hour and a half and starts down. When I took my whole day's allotment of, I think it was 25 micrograms of Cytomel in the morning, by sunset, after doing that for a few weeks, by sunset I was having hypothyroid arrhythmia. My heart would stop every 6 seconds or so for about a second or two too long. And when it would start doing that, it reminded me of several old people that I knew who had that kind of arrhythmia, a pause of a few seconds every several seconds. I found that just by chewing up a 10 microgram Cytomel, my heart rhythm would immediately be restored. A thyroid supplement had the same effect in some of my old friends. Within an hour, their pauses would quit. They would have a perfectly regular heartbeat, and if they kept that up, that would cure their circulatory problems for foot gangrene and various other problems that simply resulted from hypothyroid, poor circulation.
What do you think of Armour thyroid?
Well, I once bought a barrel of the powder, and it was very good stuff. It was the standard for all of the definitions of how thyroid works from about 1910 on. But in the late 80s or early 90s, I think it was Revlon company that bought the company from Armour, and then it went through a couple of sales each time, increasing the price. But with the final owner, they decided to process the material more than the Armour company had ever done. The Armour company tested every batch, whether it was beef or pork, glandular, or a mixture. They would test the batches on mice to make sure that it was the same potency, and then it would just add more or less glucose to reach the same potency. But the new company decided to market calcitonin, extracting it from the material. So now they kept selling it as Armour Thyroid, but it was Armour Thyroid minus thyrocalcitonin. And then they started adding different binders. At one point, they were using a polymer, I think they called it Explotab, that was supposed to make the tablet dissolve instantly when it hit water. And that was how the FDA had them demonstrate that in the presence of water, the polymer would basically puff up and release the glandular material immediately. But at the acidic pH of the stomach, the polymer failed to expand. And I talked to several people who found the pills weren't having any effect on them, and they found the undigested pills had passed through their intestine unharmed. But they've gone through so many changes, I haven't kept up with the changes, and so I don't know. Several people have remarked that for about a year it tasted like rotten meat.
So what do you suggest people do now? What kind of thyroid should they be taking?
If you mix Cytomel and a thyroxine product, for example, according to your own needs, a doctor can prescribe whatever is convenient. And some people find that a 2-to-1 ratio is practical, because if you took only Cytomel, you would have to take a little bit several times during the day to avoid that effect of the short lifetime of the T3. And to get the right mixture sometimes takes quite a while. But usually anything in the range of 4-to-1 to 2-to-1 is practical. If you take the T4 mainly at bedtime, it helps to hold your TSH down and reduce some of the nighttime stress symptoms. If you get your ratio, whatever the doctor prescribes, T4 to T3 in a ratio of maybe 4-to-1 or 2-to-1.
4-to-1 or 2-to-1 meaning Cytomel?
No, Cytomel is the smaller number.
Okay, very good.
For example, each dose shouldn't contain much more than maybe 10 micrograms of Cytomel. So if you're going to take, say, 10 micrograms of Cytomel and 40 micrograms of T4, then you should break it so that each dose doesn't give you much more than 10 micrograms of T3.
I'm sure the audience is severely confused now, but at least I wanted you to share a little bit about your take on thyroid medication and dosages and the understanding about it. Can we finish with a talk about coffee?
Okay.
It used to be that for years we were told, don't drink coffee. It's bad for you. It activates your nervous system. You shouldn't have it. And now we're learning it's good for you in moderation. Talk about it.
Big monograph on caffeine was published, I think, around 1970 that I read. And they described its anti-cancer effects, among other things. It was known at that time to protect against carcinogenesis caused by radiation or by chemical carcinogens or even viral carcinogens. Other effects, such as protecting against heart disease and many other degenerative problems, have accumulated, but it's just the last several years that it's getting into the public media a bit at a time. But that one monograph 40 years ago really defined the safety and protective qualities of caffeine. And coffee in itself, even without the caffeine, is very rich in nutrients. Dietitians' textbooks usually say that coffee has no nutritional value. But the British Journal of Nutrition did some studies showing that in the British diet, coffee provided about 20% of the vitamin mineral intake for several